Hello watch enthusiasts. It's come that time of the month in early August now, when it's time to talk about certain vintage watches which I find particularly interesting and indeed good value on the vintage market. And these watches vary from watches with curious movements to models which I think are overlooked in terms of what they offer in terms of the history of watches, and similarly certain watches which can be found in such good condition that really one couldn't really say no. In this video I also intend to cut back on my use of the word effectively, and those who've watched my previous video will know what I'm talking about, as I did rather overuse the word a bit, but thank you very much for pointing this out to me, because I really didn't notice while producing the video. However, before I begin the video, I would like to invite you all to join me on the social media platform Snubs at The Watch Guys, a group set up specifically for you, my viewers, to discuss matters of horology with me, and indeed other enthusiasts, as well as giving you the ability to ask me questions and suggest video themes and topics which you will find interesting on the channel. And I would like to thank you all you viewers who have already joined there, because it's certainly very interesting to be able to answer questions and discuss horology really with like-minded individuals and enthusiasts. And the link for this group is in the description down below, so do go and have a look. Now the first watches I'd like to talk about are Omega Constellations. And as those who are my regular viewers will know, I make no secret of the fact that I'm a great admirer of the early Constellations from Omega, because I do feel they offer a wonderful quality of movements. And it is true to say that the quality of the movements did drop through the 60s and 70s, the late 60s rather, and the 70s. But the one area where Omega's movements did remain very impressive were in the electronic line. And these are the watches I'd like to talk about today. And these were commonly known as the F300s because they ran at 300 Hz, which gave them a perfectly smooth second hand, which sweeps across the dial and gives them that typical hum that electronic watches have, rather than the tick one would expect. And similarly, these are beautifully made watches, but their movements are probably the most interesting aspect of these. And these house movements designed by Max Hetzel, and are movements which go by the name of the ESA 9162 and ESA 9184 movements, depending on the date configuration. And these were really the pinnacle of the electronic watches in the early 70s, and that's why Omega used them. Indeed, a lot of other brands did use them as well. But where Omega differentiates itself with these watches is the fact that it actually went to the trouble of replating and decorating the movements and adjusting them to their standards, which does add value to these watches in terms of being really wonderfully made pieces of engineering, not just a simple quartz watch as one might expect from an electronic timepiece. Now, what one has to remember with these watches is the fact that these watches were indeed in their era luxury products, and weren't simply a sort of little brother, if you will, to the mechanical versions. Because one can find, and I'm not suggesting in this video that these are particularly good value compared to other options, but their versions in solid gold did in fact feature a fully gold handset and dial, which I think would be rare for a watch which wasn't presented as a flagship line, and indeed something to be proud of for the brand. So it does show the confidence Omega put behind this movement in the era. And indeed, these watches come in a great deal of different shapes and sizes. There are the more early models which have a far more simple case, with more traditional lugs and proportions, whilst one has the more 70s designed versions with that sort of sunburst brushing. Now generally the colour scheme of these watches is very monochromatic, apart from little touches of red on the dial theme. So one has a simple steel case, or on some versions a gold-plated case. But the one benefit of these watches is the fact that if you do choose to go for a gold-plated version, which is probably going to be around the same price point as the equivalent steel version, the wear on these watches tends to be very minimal due to the fact that they were worn as dress watches and were marketed as such, which is a real benefit, and indeed is the case with a watch later on in the video that you'll see, which also shares this aspect of being a watch which, though gold-plated, has survived the years due to the fact that it was worn as a pure dress watch. Of course, I personally would advocate buying the steel if you were going to go for one of these watches, just because they're such beautiful timepieces in their finishing and their proportions, which are very typical of the era, which was an era when watches were indeed growing, but are still smaller by today's standards, but with such wonderful proportions and brushed and polished surfaces that I feel these really would be a wonderful addition to any collection, for the price of about £350 to £550, depending on where you look and indeed the condition of the watch itself. Though I must say that it is worth going for one in good condition, because parts of the movement aren't terribly scarce, but can be expensive to find. Now the second watches I'd like to talk about are the Zodiac SeaWolves. And these are watches released in the 1950s, in 1953 in fact, alongside the Rolex Submariner and Blancpain 50 Fathoms. And this is a dive watch which is quite interesting because it doesn't take inspiration from any other watch really, because it was in that first batch of watches released in the early 50s. And it has a truly unique dial in the watch world, with the numerals and the indices, so I suppose you get your cake and you get to eat it in this case, because you have the numerals at the quadrants of the dial, but you do also have those loomed indices. And it has a baker-like bezel as well, which is something which I personally find very, very appealing in its soft look, I suppose, which is very different to sapphire or indeed ceramic, and certainly is a vestige, I suppose, of that era. And the handset is also very telling of the batch of the watch, because the first batch of these watches, or indeed the first few years of its production, had loomed hands without that line down the middle of them, which is a very useful way of being able to tell one of the early models. And similarly, the early ones are non-hacking, which is something which certainly is something which, of course, removes a certain degree of practicality, but it does allow you to identify one of the early watches, which is something which can be very helpful with vintage watches when really identification can be one of the harder tasks. Now, these watches are actually water resistant to 200 metres, which does really impress me, I think, because these watches were in that first era of watches when a great deal of those dive watches were only 100 metres water resistant. So it does show Zodiac's influence, really, in the world of diving. And the one aspect of these watches where actually one should consider this watch, I think, over certain other dive watches of that era, is in dimensions. And this watch is incredibly slim in its thickness. It is in fact only 7.5mm thick, from the back of the case to the top of the bezel, which is something very, very impressive, especially with a water-resistant case. And they are a little bit taller to the top of that domed acrylic crystal in this case, and of course that does add a certain number of millimetres, bringing the full thickness to 11mm, which is still very slim when one considers that crystal is effectively negligible, because it'll slip under the cuff and doesn't represent any bulk, so it doesn't affect the balance of the watch at all, which is certainly something to be appreciated. Now, before you consider buying one of these, I would recommend you make several considerations with regards to the watch you're buying. And the first being these are only 35mm in diameter, so they won't really fit those with much larger wrists. For me, personally, that would be absolutely fine, and I think the smaller sizes are rather charming, but it is something to consider. The two other considerations are somewhat more major, and the first being that the bezels on these watches are plated brass, meaning they are susceptible to wear, which is something that one might want to consider before buying these watches, if you will be bothered really by the fact that the plating may come off over the years. But it is something that can't really be avoided with these watches, and frankly, for the price that you can get these for £400 to £800, I think it's still a very, very good deal. And the second, or rather third, aspect which one should consider is that I would personally steer clear of the datographic models. These are the versions with the date, because they have an offset cannon pinion which is very, very prone to wear, and that's effectively the attachment between the front of the movement and the back, and these can't be replaced. So as a result, I really would steer clear of these, because if it does break, you're going to be left with a watch which doesn't really work at all and can't be mended. So this is something to consider, so I would recommend going for the no-date models, rather than the date versions. Now, the next watches in this list are ones which I find rather curious, and which I would normally not recommend at all, because they go against most of the features which I would suggest never to buy in a vintage watch. However, there is an exception here, and these are GUB watches. And these are watches made in Germany during the Cold War years, and at first they are simply gold-plated dress watches in, for the vast majority of them, very, very poor condition, with very badly water-damaged dials and hands, as well as very poorly maintained cases. However, and there is a very major however, some of these watches have Q1 on the dial or indeed the movement, and 28 engraved on the movement as well. And this means something very interesting and in fact elevates the price of these watches immensely, in fact tenfold really from a model without this. And that's down to the movement entirely. And the reason for this is that this means, if there's the 28 and the Q1 on the dial or indeed the movement, that these watches are of the highest quality and were made by A.Lange and Sonne after the war. And of course, A.Lange has become a brand of incredible value horologically these days, producing some of the finest watches in the world. But during these years, they were reduced to very, very little, and so as a result produced movements for other brands. And as you can see here, they found their way into some watches which are really alien compared to the watches made by the brand today. But this does allow you to access a piece of history which really couldn't be found elsewhere, and for an incredible price, because you are getting a A.Lange movement for under £1,000, around the £700 mark or below I would expect for these watches. Despite their terrible condition really in terms of case and dial preservation, you really are buying these watches for the movements they house. Now, in terms of substance, one isn't getting as much as you would from other brands, for instance, for this price point in terms of finishing on the movement, which I'll focus on now because I think we've established really the condition of the case and the dial are going to be remarkably poor for this this movement. But the movements are generally undecorated, manually wound movements, which are effectively pieces of history rather than being pieces which I would recommend for daily wear. Because, of course, servicing these watches is going to be very difficult due to the fact that the movements are very scarce, and indeed acquiring a second one would be very, very expensive. But certainly they're very interesting watches for collectors, and especially movement collectors themselves, who will want a movement which is affordable, but nonetheless fascinating in terms of its history and its provenance. Now, the next watch on this list is really a range of Breitling watches under the name of the Top Time. And the Top Time has become quite an interesting watch on the vintage market, rather, because even in its day was intended as a model which was less expensive than Navitimer and Chronomat models produced by Breitling. And so it used movements really from Venus and Valjoux. So these were movements which weren't in-house to Breitling, but were indeed made by other brands, but do allow this watch to be a little bit more serviceable than other contemporary Breitlings. But these watches are quite interesting in terms of which ones you can acquire as well, because the early versions with the more traditional case, which were intended really as racing watches, can be acquired for about £1,500, although the vast majority of these watches have gold-plated cases. And this is something which is really quite often debated whether one should still buy one of these watches despite the gold-plated case. And I would argue that one should, because due to the really rather traditional shape of these watches, more often than not these watches were worn as dress watches, and so as a result have suffered very, very little wear over the years. And of course one should be careful with these watches because the plating will come off easily. But in terms of watches which are in good condition, you really can get a very attractive purchase out of these for around that price point with these gold-plated cases. And they do also feature a classically simple dial, with a tachymeter around the outside, as these were meant to be racing watches and competitors to the Rolex Daytona, and indeed various models from Hoya. So you do see a tachymeter and then a simple bicompax layout with gold hands and indices. Now, steel versions of these early models are available, but due to the fact that, for instance, these watches were worn in Thunderball, in the Bond film Thunderball, the price of these steel versions has risen quite substantially, and it's usually very difficult to get hold of one of these for under the £3,000 or £4,000 mark, due to the different dial colours and so on. But if one does appear below the £2,000 mark, which they do occasionally, they really are worth the money. The versions, however, which I feel hold even better value are the 1970s versions. And these use Valjoux movements, which are models such as the 7730, which are manually wound chronographs and are very easily serviced even these days, which is a real benefit. And these watches are available in non-plated steel with rather beautiful sunburst effects on the cases, as well as these rather attractive deep black or deep blue dial colours, And of course they have the bright oranges and the block-style hands seen on 1970s chronographs, which I think add a certain character to these watches, which one wouldn't see otherwise. And this is only emphasised by the shape of the cases, which tends to be very outlandish and 70s inspired, due to the fact that really was the era and the style then of these watches, which means that you are getting a watch which, for the price of a watch which would replicate this format in a more modern timepiece, you're getting the original piece with the original heritage and indeed the Breitling brand name, which, though I wouldn't associate brand name with quality directly, here it is a certain confirmation really of good quality. Now these watches, including the older versions with the more simple cases and the later 1970s versions with the bright colours and rather outlandish style, all come in at under £2,000, though it does take a certain amount of looking, and one does have to be quite flexible in terms of which model one is looking for. But certainly you can get a really fantastic deal on one of these really very interesting Breitlings, and a Breitling which I think is often overlooked, despite the fact that it is still an interesting timepiece, an interesting racing timepiece, at a much lower price than a vintage Rolex Daytona, or indeed any of the vintage Hoyas. Now the final watch on this list is a very, very interesting one, and one which I could have chosen a less expensive model from this brand, but I feel this one holds such an interesting part of history, and indeed in terms of being a very different model from the brand, that I really had to mention it. And this is the Doxa Sub 600T. And this is the product of the Aubry Frères. And this is a brand which took over Doxa in 1978, and signalled a change of direction really for the brand, and in fact brought about the creation of the Sub 750T and the 1000T, as well as this, the 600T. But it's the 600T I feel here which is the most interesting in terms of being a very, very different timepiece, and one which I feel will gain in value over the years due to its rarity, and the fact that it was produced for a rather short time. And this is a model from the Doxa brand which has a very, very different style of case to their normal subs. As you can see, it has a much more blocky and sharp aspect to it, as well as being somewhat smaller than some of those at only 39mm, though it is 14mm thick, which does mean that it does have a degree of heft, and doesn't appear to be too small on the wrist. And these watches come in a great variety of styles, with bezels which are simple blacked out bezels, or indeed decompression bezels as well, as seen on some of their other models. And the movement housed inside these watches is an ETA 2783, offering a very reliable and serviceable movement in such an impressive timepiece, considering this was the pinnacle of dive watches in the era. Though, of course, there were watches such as the Omega Ploprof. Doxa always really had their fair share of use by teams such as Jacques Cousteau's diving team and so on, who really did trust their lives with Doxa models, and indeed the accuracy offered by these timepieces. Now, the whole case shape of this watch is very, very different from those sharp edges which give the watch a much shorter lug-to-lug distance than one would normally expect, and indeed aesthetically it gives that feeling as well. Similarly, the crown is moved to 4 o'clock to move it out of the way and give it a slightly more modern theme than those original tonneau-style cases seen on the earlier Doxas, and is sunk into the case and fully protected, which is something I've not often seen really on watches. And in terms of the versions of this watch, there are a great number of different models, coming, really everything from the black dial professionals through to versions such as the Shark Hunter, which in this case featured shark tooth style indices, which offer a very, very different aesthetic, though of course I still do prefer the original Doxa look, with that small hour hand and much larger minute hand. So I suppose the reason why I find these watches so impressive and so fascinating really from a historical perspective is they offer a wonderful compromise between a vintage watch and one which is genuinely usable because it can be serviced easily and inexpensively, whilst also having a fantastic history with, for example, Spirotechnique on the dial, which adds that historical aspect to these watches and the fact that they were used by these major companies. Quite a lot really for a watch ranging from £2,000 to £2,200. Anyway though, I'll conclude this video here, but thank you very much for watching, and do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to enjoy more content here in future. Also, do leave your comments down below, and indeed on Snaps, on the Watch Guys, to give me an idea of what you thought of my choices, and indeed if there are any watches that you would have recommended instead. So thank you very much for watching. This is I'm on the Watch Guy, over and out.